thought the road was empty. Just another quiet drive for a veteran trying not to remember who he used to be. Then a dog barked, not in fear, but with purpose. Not his dog. A stranger's warning. A signal meant for someone who still knew how to listen. Because some fires don't start by accident, and some instincts don't belong to humans. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Legends to continue the story. The road unwound through the northern valley like a pale ribbon laid over thawing earth. It was early. Too early for errands, too late for dreams. And the light carried that brittle clarity only late winter could produce. Frost still clung to the shaded ditches. Patches of old snow hid beneath the pines. Everything else was awake, alert, and quiet. Evan Cross drove with both hands on the wheel. At 28, he looked older than his years in the way men sometimes did when their bodies learned vigilance before their minds learned rest. He stood around 6'1", shoulders broad without excess. The frame of someone who trained because it had once kept him alive, not because he wanted to be seen. A faint, old scar slept along the edge of his right shoulder, barely visible beneath the sleeve of his camouflage top. His face was clean-shaven, angular, strong jaw, high cheekbones. Handsome in a restrained, American way that didn't ask for attention. His hair, dark brown and neatly undercut, stayed disciplined even when the rest of him felt anything but. Evan's eyes, blue-gray and steady, tracked the road without rushing it. He had learned long ago that rushing invited mistakes. Beside him, the cab was quiet. Too quiet, he thought, and then corrected himself. He had grown used to quiet again, or at least he had told himself he had. In the back seat, Nick sat upright. The German Shepherd K9 was all coiled readiness and controlled restraint. 5 years old, black and tan coat cut short and thick against the cold. She held herself with the composure of a working dog who knew her purpose even when no command was given. Her muscles were lean and compact, built for sudden movement rather than show. She didn't pace. She didn't whine. Her amber eyes scanned the world through the windows, measuring distance and threat with a focus that never drifted. Nick's almost never barked. That was the rule. It wasn't a trick or a preference. It was training layered so deeply it felt like instinct. Barking drew attention. Attention could get people killed. So when her ears lifted sharply, both of them, not one at a time, Evan noticed. When her nose began to tremble, drawing short, deliberate breaths, Evan's grip tightened just enough on the wheel to register. "What is it?" he asked softly. He didn't turn around. Nix didn't answer, of course. She leaned forward instead, weight shifting, muscles tensing beneath her coat. The movement was controlled, restrained. An alert, not a panic. The road ahead was empty. No cars, no houses. Just fields, fence lines, and the pale line of trees marking the low hills beyond. Then the sound came. A bark. Ragged, frantic, tearing through the stillness like a cracked siren. Evan flinched before he could stop himself. It wasn't Nick's. The bark came again, closer this time. Desperate, not aggressive, not territorial. The sound of something calling out because it had run out of other options. Evan eased off the accelerator. He told himself it was because the road curved ahead. Because the shoulder narrowed. Because there were a dozen reasonable explanations that didn't involve stopping. Nix broke discipline. She barked, short, sharp, twice in quick succession, then surged forward until her chest pressed against the back of Evan's seat. She didn't growl. She didn't whine. She planted herself there, blocking his space, body rigid. It was wrong. Every part of it was wrong. Evan swore under his breath and slowed to a crawl. "Easy," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. The source of the sound burst from the tree line. A farm dog, medium large, dark-coated, with a rough, weathered look, shot onto the road, paws skidding slightly on the cold asphalt. Its fur was a deep brown, mottled with black, longer and uneven as if it had been brushed by wind more than hands. One ear folded forward, the other stood half upright. The dog didn't charge. It didn't bare teeth. It ran toward Evan's truck, barking hard, then stopped short and spun around, racing back toward the fields. Halfway there, it turned again. It looked at him. The eye contact lasted no more than a second, but it was deliberate, intentional. Then the dog ran again, barking over its shoulder. Nix's gaze locked onto the animal, every line of her body pulled taut with attention. She didn't look at Evan, not once. Evan's foot hovered over the brake. He didn't want this. He felt the resistance rise in him immediately, instinctive and familiar. Stopping meant involvement. Involvement meant responsibility. Responsibility meant the kind of decisions he had been trying not to make since the day he'd been told he was on medical hold and sent home with a handshake and silence. "Not my problem," he muttered, though the words sounded thin even to him. The farm dog barked again, higher this time, and disappeared behind a low rise. Nix didn't move. She stayed planted, eyes fixed on the empty space where the dog had gone, as if the ground itself might answer her. Evan exhaled slowly. He thought of the quiet months he'd spent avoiding places where people asked questions. Thought of the way stillness sometimes pressed too hard against his ribs. Thought of the countless times he had told himself that stepping away was the same as stepping forward into something new. He turned the wheel. The truck left the main road and rolled onto a narrow dirt track, gravel crunching under the tires. The farm dog reappeared almost immediately, pacing ahead now, slowing just enough to make sure Evan followed. It barked less as they went, breathy huffs replacing the sharp calls, as if conserving energy or hope. The land dipped, and the smell hit him before he saw anything. Smoke. Not thick, not obvious, just a faint, bitter thread woven into the cold air. Nix rose fully to her feet, paws braced against the seat. Her tail was still, her ears angled forward with precision. The track curved around a stand of trees, and the farm came into view. At first glance, it looked abandoned. Weathered wooden buildings crouched against the hillside, their paint long faded to gray. Fences leaned at tired angles. A farmhouse sat back from the barns, windows dark, roofline low against the sky. Then something popped, sharp and hollow. A flicker of orange licked up the side of the far barn, barely visible in the daylight. Evan stopped the truck. The farm dog sprinted toward the structure, barking again, louder now, raw with urgency, circling the building, running to a door, then back toward Evan as if pulling an invisible rope. Nix let out a low sound from deep in her chest. Not a bark. A warning. Evan was already moving. He killed the engine, grabbed his jacket, and swung out into the cold. The air carried more smoke now, stinging the back of his throat. The barn's rear wall smoldered, flames chewing quietly at old wood, fed by wind that shifted unpredictably through the valley. "Hey!" Evan shouted, scanning the yard. "Anyone here?" No answer. The farm dog raced past him, straight to a side door, and skidded to a halt. The door didn't open. It was locked. The dog threw itself against it once, twice, then turned, barking furiously, eyes wide and wet with fear. Nix ran past Evan without waiting for a command, nose down, tracking along the wall. She stopped at the hinge, sniffed, then stepped back, body angling protectively between Evan and the structure. That was when he saw it. A heavy padlock, new metal, unscorched, looped through the door hasp. This wasn't an accident. Evan stared at the lock, a cold clarity settling in his chest. Fires didn't lock doors. People did. Nix lifted her head and looked at him, not pleading, not frantic, but with a stillness that felt like judgment. The kind that asked a question without words. If this had been a mission, the parameters would have been clear. Objectives. Authority. Backup. This was none of that. The farm dog barked again, voice breaking, and somewhere inside the barn, something shifted. Wood creaking, heat building. Evan made a decision he hadn't planned on making when he turned off the main road. He circled the structure, testing doors, scanning windows. Smoke thickened near the back corner, where old hay bales smoldered beneath warped boards. The fire hadn't fully taken yet, but it would. Given time, it always did. Nick stopped abruptly, ears snapping toward a sound Evan almost missed. A cough, human, weak. Evan moved toward it without thinking, boots sinking into soft earth. He found a small window clouded with soot and wiped it clear with his sleeve. An old man lay just inside, slumped against a crate, skin gray beneath the grime. He was thin, shoulders narrow beneath a flannel shirt and a worn coat, his face lined deep by years of sun and labor. White hair clung to his scalp in uneven wisps, and his eyes fluttered as Evan shouted to him. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man's lips moved, but no sound came out. Behind Evan, the farm dog howled, a long, aching sound that cut straight through the noise of the fire. Nix shifted position again, placing herself squarely between Evan and the rising smoke, her body tense, ready. Evan scanned the door, the lock, the growing flames. He felt the old pull, the reflex to calculate, to assess risk, to choose the path with the highest survival odds. And for a heartbeat, shame flickered through him, because he realized how easy it would be to step back, to call it in, to wait. He had done that once before. The memory brushed him and was gone, leaving behind the weight of it. Evan set his jaw and grabbed the pry bar from the truck. The lock gave way with a scream of metal. The door burst open, coughing smoke into the open air. Evan dragged the man toward the light, muscles burning, lungs screaming in protest as the fire roared closer. Nick stayed at his flank the entire time, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped. A living shield between him and the worst of the heat. They got the man clear just as flames took the roof beam behind them. Evan collapsed to one knee, breathing hard, heart pounding like it used to after a sprint under fire. The old man wheezed beside him, alive. The farm dog pressed against its owner, tail shaking, licking his face frantically. Evan looked up at the barn, at the spreading fire, at the locked doors he hadn't yet checked. He felt the certainty settle in him, heavy and unavoidable. This wasn't over. Nick stood beside him, gaze fixed past the flames, ears angled toward something Evan couldn't yet hear. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking ahead, toward the fields, toward the road, toward whatever had started this long before smoke reached the sky. And Evan knew, with a clarity that cut deeper than fear, that she had known it all along. Before the bark, before the fire, before he ever smelled smoke. The dirt road narrowed as it dipped into the shallow valley, its surface rutted and soft where winter meltwater had carved thin scars through the earth. Evan drove slowly now, not because the path demanded it, but because something in the air did. The wind moved across the open fields in uneven breaths, carrying with it a scent so faint It could almost be dismissed as imagination. Almost. Nix rose fully onto her feet in the back seat, paws braced wide for balance. Her posture was no longer alert in the abstract way it had been on the main road. This was specific. Her head angled slightly to the left, nose lifting, pulling in air in short, deliberate draws. The muscles along her shoulders tightened, rippling beneath her black and tan coat. Smoke, Evan thought. Not thick smoke. Not the kind that announced itself. This was older, dirtier. Wood that had been burning slowly, starved of oxygen, waiting for the right moment to take more. He rolled the window down an inch. The cold bit his knuckles immediately, but the smell was there now, undeniable. Bitter. Dry. Okay, he muttered, mostly to himself. I smell it too. The farm appeared suddenly as the road curved around a low hill. The buildings crouched into the land as if they had been pressed there by years of wind and silence. A weathered farmhouse sat back from the road, gray boards bleached by sun and age. Its windows were dark, curtains drawn or missing entirely. To the right, a cluster of barns and sheds formed a loose semicircle, their roofs sloping at tired angles. Nothing moved. No smoke rose into the sky. No flames leapt visibly against the wood. If Evan hadn't smelled it, if Nix hadn't been standing rigid behind him, he might have driven past without a second glance. Then came the sound. A sharp crack, like a gunshot muffled by distance. Evan braked hard. Nix barked once, low and forceful, the sound ripping from her chest without hesitation. She lunged toward the door, nails scraping against the plastic panel. Evan was already reaching for the handle. The farm dog burst into view from behind the far barn, its earlier desperation now edged with panic. It ran in tight circles near a side structure, barking relentlessly, then threw itself against a wooden door with a dull thud. The door didn't move. A faint orange glow flickered at the base of the barn's rear wall, licking upward as if testing the air. "Damn it," Evan said under his breath. He scanned the yard quickly. No vehicles, no people running, no hoses laid out, no buckets, no sign that help had been called. The fire was there, real and growing, but the farm itself felt abandoned, as if sound had been deliberately drained from the place. Evan pulled the pry bar from the truck's side compartment as Nix hit the ground beside him. She didn't rush the flames. She didn't chase the panicking farm dog. Instead, she moved along the barn's perimeter, nose down, tail stiff, tracking something Evan couldn't see. The wind shifted, and smoke rolled low across the ground. "Anyone here?" Evan shouted, his voice carrying farther than he expected in the open valley. "Hello?" No answer. The farm dog barked again, sharper now, and leapt at the locked door, scraping its paws uselessly against the wood. Its coat was streaked with soot, and one side of its muzzle was damp, either from saliva or frantic licking. Up close, Evan could see how lean it was, ribs faintly visible beneath the fur. A working dog that lived outdoors and earned its meals. Nix stopped abruptly at the barn's corner. She froze. Not crouched, not tense, completely still. That, Evan knew, was never a good sign. He followed her gaze and saw what she had found. The fire wasn't spreading evenly. It was concentrated at the back, where old hay and timber had been stacked carelessly against the wall. The flames were low now, but the heat was building. The structure was primed. Nix shifted sideways, placing herself between Evan and the thickest smoke, head turning slightly as if measuring time rather than distance. "You're telling me something," Evan said quietly. She didn't look at him. Another sound cut through the crackle of burning wood. A cough, rough and wet, followed by a weak thud from inside the barn. Evan moved without thinking. The door nearest him was locked. A heavy padlock hung from the hasp, its metal bright and new, untouched by heat. He tugged at it once, hard. It didn't budge. Nix growled then, not at the fire, not at the door, but at the lock itself, a low vibration that spoke of recognition rather than anger. "This isn't right," Evan muttered. He brought the pry bar down in a clean, controlled strike. Metal shrieked, the lock snapping loose on the second blow. Smoke rushed out as the door flew open, stinging his eyes and filling his lungs with heat and ash. Inside, the air was dim and thick. Evan dropped to one knee, scanning through the haze. An old man lay, slumped against a crate near the far wall. He was thin, almost frail. His body folded in on itself as if trying to take up less space. His hair was white and sparse, plastered to his forehead with sweat. The skin of his face was lined deep, not just by age, but by years of exposure to wind and sun. His clothes, flannel shirt, heavy work coat, were scorched at the edges, and his breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls. "Hey," Evan said, his voice firm now. "Sir, stay with me." The man's eyes fluttered open, cloudy with smoke. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Behind Evan, the farm dog barked again, frantic, then darted toward the side of the barn and back, as if insisting there was more. Nix appeared at Evan's shoulder, then moved past him into the smoke without waiting. She stopped abruptly near a second door, her nose pressed to the crack beneath it. She scratched once, sharp, deliberate, locked. Evan swore and dragged the old man toward the open door, muscles straining as the fire crackled louder behind them. The man coughed violently, clutching at Evan's sleeve with surprising strength. Eyes wide now, with fear. They cleared the threshold just as a beam overhead gave way, crashing down in a spray of sparks. Evan laid the man on the cold ground, rolling him onto his side the way he'd been taught, slapping his back until a deep, rattling cough shook loose a mouthful of soot. The farm dog rushed forward, pressing against the man's chest, whining softly now, tail tucked low but wagging in frantic relief. Nix didn't join them. She stood at the barn door, staring back into the smoke. "Nix," Evan called. She didn't move. That was when Evan noticed the second door's handle shuddering faintly from the inside. Someone else was trapped. He spun back toward the fire, heart pounding. "Hold on," he shouted, though he didn't know who he was shouting to. He grabbed the pry bar again and charged toward the other door. It was heavier, warped by age and heat. The lock was older this time, rusted, but it held stubbornly. Nix barked, once, sharp, urgent, and leapt back, positioning herself between Evan and the sagging roofline. He felt the heat surge, saw the beam above them bow. "Damn it!" he hissed, yanking at the lock with all his strength. It snapped free just as the roof shifted again. The door burst open, and a woman stumbled out, coughing hard, her face streaked with soot. She was in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, tall and lean beneath a thick work jacket. Her dark hair had been pulled back into a low ponytail that had come loose, strands clinging to her sweat-damp cheeks. Her eyes were sharp despite the smoke, brown and focused, even as panic flickered through them. She braced herself against the wall, sucking in air. "My father," she rasped. "Is he?" "He's alive," Evan said quickly. "You're out. That's what matters right now." She nodded once, jaw tight, then bent over, hands on her knees, forcing herself to breathe. Only then did Evan realize something else. No one had screamed for help. No one had run toward the road. The fire had been burning long enough to trap 2 people, and still, no sirens, no neighbors. No calls for help echoing across the fields. The woman straightened slowly, wiping her face with the sleeve of her jacket. Up close, Evan could see the exhaustion etched into her features. Not just from the smoke, but from something older. Her posture was rigid, guarded, as if she expected trouble even now. "You didn't call anyone," Evan said, keeping his tone neutral. "Why?" She looked at him then. Really looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing whether the truth was worth the effort. "Because the last time we called for help," she said quietly, "they didn't come with hoses." She glanced toward the road, then back at the barn, flames now climbing higher. "They came with paperwork." Nix turned her head at that, ears twitching, gaze shifting from the fire to the fields beyond the farm. For a brief moment, just long enough for Evan to notice, she stepped away from the barn and sat down, facing outward, her back to the people she had just helped save, as if guarding them from something that hadn't arrived yet. Evan followed Nix's line of sight. There was nothing there. Just empty land rolling out toward the horizon, pale under the winter sun. But Nix didn't move. She didn't relax. And Evan felt the unsettling certainty that the fire had never been the loudest danger on this farm. The woman introduced herself as Claire Moore once the immediate danger had eased. Her voice had steadied, but her hands still trembled slightly as she helped her father sit up against the truck's tire. "Silas Moore." She said his name with a mixture of irritation and relief, like someone used to worrying about a man who refused to be careful. Silas was slow to speak once he could breathe again. When he did, his voice was thin but firm, edged with stubborn pride. He thanked Evan once, curtly, then turned his gaze back to the burning barn with a look that suggested loss weighed heavier on him than fear. Evan stood there, watching the flames eat through old wood, watching Nix scan the fields, watching Claire move with practiced efficiency despite the shock. He felt the familiar urge to step back. This was where he usually stopped. Hand things over. Let systems grind forward, however imperfectly. Tell himself he'd done enough. But the words Claire had spoken lingered, sharp and unresolved. Paperwork. Evan thought of locked doors, new padlocks, fires that burned quietly. He looked down at Nix. She finally turned back to him, eyes meeting his, not accusing, not pleading, just present. Evan exhaled slowly, the decision settling in him whether he wanted it to or not. This wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Evan didn't charge into the fire the way stories like to remember men like him. There was no shout, no dramatic pause. He moved the way people did when chaos was familiar. Fast, yes, but precise. His boots hit the dirt hard, testing ground and balance in the same instinctive rhythm he'd learned years ago, when hesitation cost more than bruises. Heat rolled across the yard in uneven waves. Smoke stayed low, hugging the earth as if it had learned where lungs lived. Evan angled his body against the wind, jacket half-zipped, eyes narrowed, scanning not just the flames, but the spaces between them. Nix broke away immediately. She didn't follow him. She veered left, then cut sharply around the rear of the barn, moving against the direction of the smoke. Her body stayed low, tail straight, nose working in fast, efficient pulls. Where Evan read structures and angles, Nix read air. "Find me a way," Evan muttered. Though he knew she didn't need to hear it. The farm, a dog, dark-coated, lean, its sides heaving, circled the locked stall again, barking relentlessly. It didn't bite at the wood or claw blindly. It focused on the lock, slamming its shoulder near the metal, then backing up and barking again, sharp and insistent. Evan noticed that. Locks didn't draw attention from animals unless they mattered. He moved toward the stall just as a low, hollow boom echoed from inside the barn. Something collapsing. Something giving way. The flames flared brighter, fed by a sudden rush of oxygen. "Hey!" Evan shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "Anyone still inside?" A rasping sound answered him. Weak, human. Silas Moore lay just inside the main aisle, collapsed against a feed bin. Up close, Evan could see how thin the old man really was. Silas was in his early 70s, maybe older. His frame worn down by decades of labor rather than age alone. His shoulders sloped inward, not from frailty but from years of carrying weight alone. His face was deeply lined, skin rough and weathered. The kind that told stories of sunburns, early mornings, and long winters without complaint. Silas tried to rise when he saw Evan, stubborn pride flashing through the smoke. "Don't," Evan said firmly, crouching beside him. "You'll pass out." Silas's breath wheezed, shallow and uneven. His eyes were sharp, though, gray and alert, still tracking the fire, the doors, the places that mattered. "She's in there," Silas croaked, nodding toward the far stalls. "Claire." Evan didn't hesitate. He shifted Silas into a sitting position, propping him against the bin where the air was marginally clearer. "Stay here," Evan ordered. "Breathe slow." Silas caught his sleeve with surprising strength. "Doors are locked," he said. "Not from inside." That matched what Evan had already suspected. He pushed deeper into the barn, keeping low. The heat intensified near the rear, where stacked hay smoldered instead of burning clean. The smell was wrong, not just wood and straw, but something chemical, faint and bitter. Claire Moore was wedged near the second stall door, coughing violently, one arm wrapped around her ribs. She was taller than Evan had first thought, lean, broad-shouldered in the way women who worked physical land often were. Her dark hair had been pulled back into a low tie that had partially come loose, strands sticking to her sweat and soot-streaked face. Her skin was pale beneath the grime, eyes sharp and focused even through panic. She wasn't screaming. She was conserving air. Evan took that in immediately. This wasn't someone waiting to be rescued. This was someone trapped by circumstances she didn't control. "The door," she rasped. "It was open this morning." Evan glanced at the lock. Thick metal, newly bolted, edges still clean despite the smoke. This wasn't old hardware forgotten over time. "This isn't an accident," Evan said. More to himself than to her. Nix reappeared at the far end of the barn, barking once, short, sharp, then circling back toward him. She stopped near the rear wall, paws digging into the dirt, head tilted slightly. Wind shift. Evan felt it a moment later. The fire surged, flames bending toward the center aisle. They were running out of time. He yanked on the locked stall door. It didn't move. The farm dog rammed the lock again, barking frantically, eyes wild. "I need leverage," Evan muttered. He backed out of the barn just long enough to wave down movement near the road. Two neighbors had arrived, drawn by the smoke, not by sirens. One was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, beard thick and graying, wearing a canvas jacket streaked with oil. The other was younger, early 30s maybe, bundled in a hoodie, eyes wide with shock. "You," Evan barked, pointing to the older man. "You got a tractor?" The man nodded once, already moving. "Down the road. Bring it. Now." Evan didn't try to do everything himself. That was the difference between impulse and experience. Heroes burned out. Coordinators survived. Nick stayed near the barn's rear, tracking the shifting wind, barking once whenever the smoke thickened dangerously in a new direction. Evan used those cues instinctively, pulling people back seconds before the heat spiked. The tractor roared into the yard, engine cutting through the chaos. Evan directed it toward the locked stall, guiding the driver with sharp hand signals. "Hit the hinge," Evan shouted, "not the lock." Metal screamed as the tractor's bucket slammed into the door frame. Wood splintered. The lock tore free in a shower of sparks. Claire stumbled out, coughing hard, her knees buckling. Evan caught her before she hit the ground, hauling her clear just as flames surged through the opening she'd been trapped behind. Silas let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh when he saw her. They cleared the yard in moments, dragging equipment, animals, and whatever could still move away from the structure as the fire finally took full hold. Flames climbed the barn walls now, visible and violent, the way fires looked when they no longer hid. No sirens came. No flashing lights cut through the smoke. Just people, standing in the cold, watching years of work burn. Nick stood slightly apart, body angled outward, ears rotating slowly. She wasn't watching the fire. She was watching the road. Evan noticed Nick's stance and felt the familiar tightening between his shoulders. Not danger immediate. Something else. The kind that waited. Once the worst had passed, Evan turned back to Silas. The old man sat on the tailgate of the tractor now, wrapped in a blanket someone had found, breathing steadier. His hands shook, not from cold but from adrenaline finally ebbing. Evan crouched in front of him. "Why didn't you call the fire department?" Silas stared at the burning barn for a long moment before answering. His jaw tightened, the muscles along his face flexing with restrained anger rather than fear. "Because last time," Silas said quietly, "they didn't come with water." He finally looked at Evan then, eyes sharp despite the exhaustion. "They came with paperwork." Claire stiffened beside him. Evan waited. Silas swallowed. 3 years back, inspection. Complaints nobody could trace. They said the land wasn't compliant, that the structures were unsafe. His mouth twisted bitterly. Funny how they only noticed after we refused to sell. Evan's stomach sank. "Sell to who?" he asked. Silas shook his head slowly. "Doesn't matter. Same story everywhere. Pressure, fines, threats dressed up as concern." Claire spoke up then, voice low but steady. "We called for help once. They shut us down for a week. Cost us more than the fire ever will." Evan looked back at the barn, now fully engulfed. Locked doors, new hardware, quiet fire, paperwork before water. He felt the line he'd been standing on give way beneath his feet. Nix turned from the road and looked at him, eyes steady, unblinking. Not alarmed. Certain. Evan exhaled slowly. This wasn't about saving a barn anymore. It hadn't been from the start. By the time the flames surrendered to ash and steam, the valley had gone quiet again. Not the clean quiet of snowfall or distance, but the uneasy kind that followed destruction. Smoke drifted low across the ground, curling around fence posts and blackened beams. The barn was no longer a structure so much as a skeleton. Charred ribs, warped metal, and a roof that had collapsed inward like a lung that could no longer hold air. Evan stood with his hands on his hips, jacket unzipped, breath slow but heavy. Soot streaked his sleeves. His boots were wet from melted frost and fire suppressant hauled in buckets by neighbors who had arrived too late to save wood, but just in time to save lives. Nix paced the edge of the burned ground in a slow, deliberate pattern. She did not sniff randomly. Her nose traced a line, barn to ditch, ditch to tree line, then back again, as if following something only she could still see now that the fire was gone. Silas Moore sat on an overturned feed trough near the house, a wool blanket wrapped tight around his narrow shoulders. In daylight, his exhaustion showed more clearly. His hands were large, but worn thin, veins standing out beneath sun-darkened skin. He stared at the remains of the barn, with a look that wasn't grief so much as resignation. Claire stood beside him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Up close, Evan noticed how controlled she was. Not calm, controlled. Her posture stayed upright despite fatigue, chin lifted as if refusing to be folded inward by loss. Her jacket was streaked with soot, hair pulled back again with hands that shook only slightly. There was strength there, but it had been shaped by endurance, not hope. Evan walked the perimeter once more, letting his instincts do what his eyes couldn't. That was when he saw it. The electrical line that ran from the pole toward the barn ended abruptly near the ground. The cable hadn't snapped from heat. The copper inside was cleanly exposed, insulation sliced, away with precision. Cut by hand. Evan crouched, fingers hovering just above the edge without touching it. Years of habit stopped him from contaminating anything unnecessarily, even here, even now. Nick stopped beside him and sat. That alone was unusual. She didn't sit unless something had resolved, or unless she was marking a point of significance. Evan followed her gaze. A few yards away, the ground dipped into a shallow drainage ditch that ran along the property line. Half hidden by scorched grass and melting frost was a red plastic fuel can, its side warped slightly by heat, but intact. The cap was loose. Evan closed his eyes briefly. So that was how it had burned so quietly. Slow fuel, controlled spread, time bought on purpose. He straightened and walked back toward Silas and Claire, the weight of the realization settling into his chest like a familiar pressure. This wasn't an accident, Evan said calmly. Silas let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if it didn't sound so tired. No, he said. It wasn't. Claire's jaw tightened. We figured that much. Evan studied them both. How long? Silas didn't answer right away. He rubbed his palms together, a habit that spoke of cold and nerves and years of repeating the same motion while waiting for something to pass. Couple of years, he said finally. Started with letters, then visits. From who? Evan asked. Silas shrugged. Men in clean coats, polite voices, smiles that never quite settled right. He glanced toward the road. They liked to talk about opportunity, about how this land could be put to better use. Claire spoke next, voice low and steady. They came more often after we said no. Evan nodded once. He had heard variations of this story before. Different places, same shape. What kind of visits? He asked. Silas's mouth tightened. Questions, inspections, notices taped to the door, small fines that added up. Looked down at his hands. Nothing illegal enough to fight cleanly. Just enough to wear you down. Nix rose and walked past them toward the old storage shed near the back of the property. She stopped in front of it and stood perfectly still, body squared, head level. Evan noticed that she had been doing that all morning, positioning herself between people and certain places, as if drawing invisible lines. Claire followed Evan's gaze. That shed, she said quietly. They asked about that one a lot. Evan turned back to her. Why? Claire hesitated. Just a beat too long. Because it's close to the boundary, she said, and because it's old. Easier to label unsafe. Silas snorted softly. They wanted us scared, or tired, or both. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet ash and fuel residue. Evan felt something inside him tighten. Not anger exactly, but recognition. He had lived too long in systems that wore people down quietly. He walked toward the shed. Nix didn't move to block him. Instead, she stepped aside just enough to let him pass, then turned and sat again, facing outward. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the shed was empty save for old tools, rusted hinges, and a stack of broken fencing. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. And yet, Nix remained alert. Evan stepped back outside. Claire was watching him now, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to get involved," she said. "You've done more than enough." Evan met her eyes. He saw the hope she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge and the fear that followed it. "I know," he said. And that was the truth. Nix suddenly moved. She crossed the yard and stopped directly in front of Evan, blocking his path. She didn't bark, she didn't growl. She simply stood there, eyes locked on his, tail still. Evan froze. It wasn't a warning, it was a question. For a moment the world narrowed. The burned barn, the exhausted faces, the quiet road beyond. The trees. Nix had done this before, long ago, in another place, when Evan had hesitated 1 second too long. His chest tightened. "I see it," he said softly, though no one else could hear. Nix stepped aside. Later, when the neighbors had drifted back to their own lives and the fire was nothing but steam rising from blackened beams, Evan sat on the tailgate of his truck, staring at the dirt road that led back to nowhere. He realized something uncomfortable. He was good at this part. Standing at the edge, assessing damage, helping just enough to justify leaving. For years he had told himself that restraint was discipline, that stepping away was wisdom, that not every wrong was his responsibility. But looking at Silas's burned barn, at Claire's tight grip on herself, at Nix's unwavering presence, that logic felt thinner than it used to. Silas approached quietly, cane tapping softly against the ground. "You know," the old man said, not looking at Evan, "fire's just the last step." Evan turned his head slightly. "What burns first," Silas continued, "is patience, then trust. After that, people." Evan nodded once. He thought of the cut wire, the hidden fuel, the polite men with their papers. He thought of how easily silence became habit. Nix lay down near the shed, head resting on her paws, eyes open, guarding. Evan stood. He didn't announce anything, didn't promise help or justice or protection. He simply looked at the land one more time, at what had been lost and what had been endured. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something shift, not outward, but inward. The realization came quietly, without drama. What had burned this place wasn't gasoline. It was resignation. And Evan knew, with an unsettling clarity, that walking away now would mean feeding the same fire somewhere else. Night came down over the valley without ceremony. The fire crews had left an hour earlier, their engines fading into the distance, taking with them the last official sign that anything unusual had happened here at all. What remained was darkness, a burned structure still breathing heat, and the soft glow of work lights strung hastily between fence posts. Evan sat on the tailgate of his truck, elbows resting on his knees, staring into the blackened remains of the barn. Ash drifted occasionally in the cold air like gray snow. The land felt different now, emptier, stripped of any illusion that it would protect the people who lived on it. Nix lay near his feet, head up, ears loose, but attentive. Her breathing was slow, measured. She looked calm, but Evan had learned not to confuse stillness with rest. Silas and Claire were inside the farmhouse, lights on low, voices muted. They had insisted Evan stay, not with words, just with the quiet understanding that leaving now would feel wrong. The night deepened. Then Nix rose, not smoothly, not alert, curious, violently. She sprang to her feet, hackles lifting, and barked, loud, sharp, repeated, her voice ripping through the quiet like broken glass. Evan was on his feet instantly. "What is it?" he demanded, already scanning the dark. Nix ran toward the open field beyond the burned barn, barking again, her body rigid with urgency. She stopped at the edge of the grass, staring into the darkness beyond the reach of the work lights. Evan followed, boots crunching softly, heart rate climbing into familiar territory. The field stretched wide and empty. Frost glittered faintly under the moonlight. No movement, no sound beyond the distant wind moving through dry grass. Nothing. Nix barked again, then paced in a tight circle, head swinging left and right, nose testing the air in sharp pulls. Evan swept the field with his eyes, then with his phone's flashlight. The beam cut a narrow tunnel through the dark and found only weeds, fence posts, and shadows that resolved into nothing. "Easy," he said, more firmly now. "There's nothing there." Nix didn't relax, but she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Evan felt it like a misstep. He waited longer than he wanted to, scanning the field, listening past the ringing in his ears. Still nothing. No engine noise, no footsteps, no silhouettes retreating into the dark. Slowly, Nix's barking stopped. Her tail lowered. Her posture shifted, not defeated, but uncertain. Evan exhaled sharply, irritation creeping in despite himself. It was subtle, but it was there. "Come on," he said, turning back toward the truck. "You were wrong this time." Nix followed, but not immediately. She looked back once more at the field before padding after him, head lower than before. That unsettled Evan more than the barking had. Back at the truck, he rubbed his face with both hands, fingers scraping soot and fatigue from his skin. The adrenaline had nowhere to go now, and it turned inward. For the first time since arriving, doubt slipped in. He had already crossed lines tonight, stayed longer than planned. Read intent where maybe there was only coincidence. Seen patterns because he was trained to look for them. He had promised himself, after everything, that he wouldn't live like this anymore. Always braced, always waiting for the next threat. Nix lay down near the truck, but she didn't curl up. Her head remained lifted, eyes still trained toward the field. Evan noticed and chose, deliberately, not to comment. A few minutes passed. Then the farm dog barked. Not from the yard, from the road. The sound was frantic, hoarse with urgency, nothing like the territorial barks Evan had heard earlier. Tires crunched softly on gravel somewhere beyond the trees. Evan snapped upright. Nix was already moving. They reached the edge of the driveway just in time to see it. A pickup truck sat half hidden beyond the far fence line, engine idling, low, headlights off. It was parked at an angle that suggested observation, not arrival. Someone was inside. Evan could feel it even before the driver shifted, the silhouette briefly outlined by dashboard light. The farm dog lunged toward the fence, barking furiously. The pickup's engine revved. "Hey!" Evan shouted, stepping forward into the open. For a heartbeat, the truck didn't move. Then the driver saw him. The engine roared to life, gravel spraying as the vehicle tore down the dirt road, taillights flaring red before vanishing into the dark. Evan ran a few steps after it, stopping short when he realized how futile pursuit would be on foot. Silence fell again. Heavier this time. Nix stood beside him, body tense but steady, eyes fixed on the road where the truck had disappeared. She didn't bark now. She didn't pace. She waited. Evan crouched near the fence line, scanning the ground with his flashlight. Fresh tire tracks cut deep into the soft earth, angling away from the farm, deliberate and clean. Something white lay near the ditch. He picked it up. Paper, several sheets folded hastily, edges damp with frost. The top page bore a logo, simple, modern, printed in sharp black lines. Below it, a heading caught the light. Land Acquisition Notice. Evan's jaw tightened. He flipped through the pages quickly. Parcel numbers, boundary references, formal language stripped of context or compassion. At the bottom of one page, a company name appeared again and again. A development firm. The same kind Silas had described earlier. Clean, polite, persistent. Evan straightened slowly, the papers clenched in his fist. Behind him, Nix finally relaxed just enough to sit. She looked up at him, eyes calm, unreadable. "You weren't wrong," Evan said quietly. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The frustration he'd felt minutes earlier drained away, replaced by something colder and sharper. Nix hadn't misread danger. She had sensed preparation. Timing, not intent, had been the variable, and his doubt, his hesitation, had almost been enough to let it slip past him unnoticed. Evan walked back toward the farmhouse, the papers folded carefully now, treated like evidence rather than trash. Light spilled from the windows, warm and fragile against the night. Claire opened the door when she saw him approaching. Her face tightened when she saw the papers in his hand. "They came back," Evan said simply. She didn't ask who. Inside, Silas listened in silence as Evan explained what he'd seen. The old man's expression didn't change much, but his shoulders sagged a little more with each sentence, as if confirmation weighed heavier than surprise. "I told you," Silas said quietly when Evan finished. "They don't rush. They watch." Evan nodded. He stepped back outside, letting the cool air steady him. Nix followed, settling near the porch steps, eyes once again on the road. Evan leaned against the railing, staring out into the dark fields. He thought about the moment earlier, the doubt, the irritation, the urge to walk away. How close he had come to telling himself this wasn't his problem. Nix shifted slightly, pressing her shoulder against his leg. Not hard, not demanding. Present. Evan rested his hand briefly on her head, fingers brushing the coarse fur behind her ears. "Next time," he said quietly, "I won't second-guess you." Nix didn't react. She didn't need reassurance. The night stretched on, heavy with things unsaid and plans not yet formed. Somewhere down the road, an engine faded into nothing, carrying intent with it. And Evan understood, finally, what this moment was asking of him. Not heroics, not rescue, attention. Spring did not arrive in Frosthaven the way people imagined it should. There was no sudden thaw, no dramatic break in the sky. Winter loosened its grip reluctantly, day by day, as if testing whether the land could be trusted again. Snow softened at the edges. Ice sighed instead of cracking. The lake held on longest, its surface dull and gray, resisting the idea of release. The cabin changed with it. What had begun as shelter became something else. Slowly, quietly. The floors carried more footsteps now. The air smelled not only of clean fabric and oil, but of soup, bread, and earth turned carefully with bare hands. Elias Crowley recovered in increments. At first it was just standing longer at the counter, then cooking full meals instead of reheating portions. His cough faded to a memory. His hands, once raw and trembling, grew steadier. He began repairing things. Loose hinges, a chair that wobbled, the old fence line near the trees. He worked slowly, deliberately, as if each task returned a piece of himself that had been misplaced. In the mornings, he tended a small patch of ground near the cabin, clearing stones, testing soil that still smelled of frost. There was dignity in the rhythm of it. No one praised him. No one needed to. Rowan watched without comment. He still had long nights. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and unpredictable. Some nights he woke with his heart racing, breath too fast, mind already scanning for exits that were no longer necessary. The past did not vanish just because the present had improved. But now, when he sat up in the dark, he was not alone. Sable would already be awake, her head lifted, eyes reflecting the faintest light. She did not crowd him, did not intrude. She simply existed within reach, steady, breathing, present. Sometimes Elias coughed in his sleep, a soft reminder of shared space. Sometimes the wind worried the trees outside. Rowan learned to let those sounds anchor him instead of threaten him. One afternoon, Deputy Tessa Lane arrived without calling ahead. She parked near the tree line and walked the rest of the way, hands in her jacket pockets, shoulders relaxed. Without the uniform, she looked younger, hair loose, boots scuffed from use rather than polish. Her expression, however, was the same, observant, thoughtful. "Investigation's spreading," she said once she stepped inside. Gideon Vance wasn't alone. He was convenient. Rowan nodded, unsurprised. "People are talking now," Tessa continued. "Records are being rechecked. Names that haven't come up in years are coming up again." She glanced at Elias, who was sanding a length of wood near the stove. "You did more than protect one man." Elias looked up briefly, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just stayed." Tessa smiled faintly. "Turns out that's harder." She stayed for coffee. Not long. She didn't linger. The lake finally gave way in late March. Rowan stood at the edge one morning, boots planted firmly on damp ground, watching thin plates of ice drift apart, bumping gently against one another. The sound was soft, almost polite. Sable sat beside him, tail wrapped around her paws. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "I used to think surviving was enough," Rowan said quietly, more to the water than to the dog. "Just get through. Don't sink." Sable's ears flicked at his voice. Rowan exhaled. "Turns out, staying is harder." Sable did not look at the lake. She looked at him. Later that week, Rowan nailed a small wooden sign to the post near the cabin path. The letters were simple, uneven, carved by hand, and sanded smooth. Frost Haven Watch. Warm coffee. Quiet help, that was all. No schedule, no mission statement, no explanation. People began to arrive slowly, cautiously, as if unsure they were allowed. A man with a veteran's posture stood on the porch one afternoon, eyes tired, hands folded behind his back. He stayed until Sable rested her head briefly against his knee, and whatever words he'd prepared slipped away. An older woman brought bread and stayed to sit. A teenager stopped by to fix a headlight and ended up listening more than he spoke. Rowan never called it a project. He called it Tuesday. On the last truly cold night of the season, the sky cleared completely. Stars appeared one by one, sharp and bright against the dark. The lake reflected them faintly, its surface no longer sealed, but not yet free. Rowan stood outside with Sable at his side. Inside, Elias hummed softly off-key, tending something on the stove. The sound carried through the open window, ordinary and human. Rowan rested his hand at Sable's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth there. He understood something then, not as revelation, not as victory, but as truth finally accepted. He had not saved her. She had chosen him, on a street corner, in the cold, because she had seen something in him he could not see himself. The courage to stay, the willingness to carry weight without needing applause, the quiet strength to let life return, one small faithful act at a time. Winter did not end with a battle. It ended with a door left open. Evan stayed, not because anyone asked him to, not because the land demanded it. He stayed because leaving now would have meant pretending the choice he'd made was temporary. Morning came with a different weight this time. The valley looked the same. Fields pale under frost, smoke long gone, the barn reduced to blackened geometry. But something underneath had shifted. Not resolved, not healed, acknowledged. Nix moved beside him as he walked the perimeter of the farm, her stride loose, controlled, the way it always was after danger had been named and contained. She no longer scanned the fields for movement. Her attention had narrowed, not outward, but through things. Doors, paths, people. Evan noticed that change immediately. It wasn't vigilance anymore. It was guardianship. He didn't choose confrontation, not the kind that burned bright and collapsed under its own noise. Instead, he chose friction, selective cooperation. He met again with Deputy Aaron Hale in the small county office that smelled faintly of old coffee and dust. Aaron listened, took notes, asked careful questions. He never promised speed. He never pretended the system would move faster than it was built to. But he didn't shut the door either. "You're doing this the hard way," Aaron said quietly as they stood near the doorway afterward. Evan nodded. "The loud way collapses." Aaron studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. "I'll keep things moving where I can." That was all Evan expected. The second meeting happened 2 days later, in the corner booth of a diner just off the state road. The windows were fogged from heat and grease, muting the outside world. The woman across from him sat with her notebook closed, hands folded loosely on the table, as if she didn't need it yet. Mara Winslow was in her mid-30s, lean, sharp-featured, with auburn hair cut just below her jaw in a practical line that framed her face without softening it. Her eyes were quick, not suspicious, but trained. She wore a dark jacket dusted with road salt and boots scuffed from standing in places that didn't welcome questions. She didn't introduce herself with credentials. She didn't need to. "I don't publish rumors," she said plainly, "and I don't publish everything at once." Evan appreciated that immediately. "I don't need noise," he replied. "I need daylight." Mara's mouth curved. Not a smile exactly. "Then, we'll take it slow." They didn't talk about Silas by name at first, or the Moors, or even the fire. They talked about patterns, land purchased quietly through shell entities, complaints filed anonymously, fires ruled inconclusive, people worn down until selling felt like relief rather than loss. Mara already had half the puzzle. Evan brought the rest. Documents, photos, timelines, the cut wire, the fuel can, the truck seen watching in the dark. The papers dropped in haste. Nothing dramatic, just enough over the mouth. Next week's, the truth surfaced in fragments. An article about land pressure here. A follow-up about suspicious fires there. A sidebar on inspection abuse buried deep on page 3. No accusations shouted. No villains named outright. But the connections were clear to anyone who knew how to read them. Silas Moore never gave an interview. He didn't need to. He stayed on his land, rebuilding slowly, fence by fence, shed by shed. His posture changed first. He stood straighter, moved with less hesitation. When officials came now, they came in daylight, with notice, with witnesses. Claire changed in quieter ways. She still spoke carefully, but her voice no longer tightened when trucks slowed near the road. She began attending county meetings again, sitting in the back at first, then closer to the front, listening, speaking once when it mattered. Evan watched that transformation with a kind of distant respect. Courage, he had learned, rarely announced itself. It just showed up again the next day. The farm dog stayed. It lay near the rebuilt fence most afternoons, dark coat blending into shadow, eyes tracking movement with calm authority. It didn't bark unless necessary. It didn't wander far. A gatekeeper. Nix acknowledged it once with a low huff, tail still, eyes steady. Recognition. Nix herself settled back into her familiar silence. But Evan noticed the difference. She no longer reacted first to noise. She reacted to intent. Her ears twitched when papers changed hands, when unfamiliar vehicles slowed without reason, when conversations shifted tone. She didn't bark. She adjusted position, blocking lines, guarding thresholds. Evan found himself trusting that more than anything else. Weeks passed. The land company pulled back quietly, freezing activity in the valley under the vague language of internal review. No apologies, no admissions, just absence. One evening, as winter edged closer, Evan walked the long road back toward town with Nix at his side. Air was clean, sharp, the sky bruised purple with approaching dusk. Halfway down the road, something caught his eye. A new sign stood at the edge of a neighboring property. For sale. Clean, white. Fresh stakes driven deep into frozen ground. Evan stopped. Nix did too. She didn't bark, she didn't growl. Her ears lifted slightly, just enough to register interest, and her gaze fixed on the sign. Not with alarm, but with understanding. Evan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear. Resolve. For the first time, Evan realized something clearly. This wasn't a single battle. It was a terrain. And Nix wasn't watching for fire anymore. She was watching for patterns. They stood there for a long moment, man and dog. The road stretching forward into quiet uncertainty. Evan didn't tear the sign down. He didn't photograph it. He didn't call anyone. Not yet. He turned and walked back toward the farm, Nix pacing him step for step. Behind them, the sign remained. Silent, patient, waiting for the next person to decide whether silence was easier than standing. Evan knew his answer now, not because he had trained for it, not because anyone had ordered it, but because this time, when the moment came, he didn't look away. Nix glanced up at him once as they reached the gate, amber eyes steady. Evan nodded, the gesture small but complete. The road ahead wouldn't be clean or quick or heroic, but he wouldn't turn back. And this time, neither would the silence. Sometimes, miracles do not arrive as fire from the sky or voices from the clouds. Sometimes they come quietly, through instinct, through conscience, through the moment we choose not to look away. In this story, the dog did not speak. The man did not receive an order. Yet something unseen guided them both. Many believe God acts only through grand signs, but often his presence moves through smaller things. A warning we feel but cannot explain. A choice that feels heavy but necessary. A moment when silence is easier, and we choose truth instead. In everyday life, we face the same crossroads. We may not stand before burning barns or open injustice, but we are asked again and again, whether we will stay quiet or stand firm when something is wrong. If this story touched you, let it be a reminder. You are never alone when you choose what is right, even when the road is quiet. Even when the outcome is uncertain, may God protect you, guide your decisions, and give you courage in your own unseen battles. If this message resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment with your thoughts or experiences. And subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Legends to continue stories about faith, instinct, and the strength to stand when it matters most. May God bless you and keep you safe.